Hi everyone, welcome to our symposium, Depression Service Status and the Effects of Life Circumstances on Depressive Symptoms in Adults on Autism Spectrum. For our symposium, we'll be using the terms adults on the autism spectrum and autistic adults interchangeably throughout the presentations, given these are preferred terms by stakeholders in the autism community. I'm Zheng, I'm the chair for today's symposium, and will also be leading the first presentation. I'm currently a postdoc researcher at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF. I'm joined today by my mentor, Dr. Summer Bishop, who is a co-chair for today's symposium. Dr. Bishop is an associate professor of psychiatry at UCSF. A little bit of background for today's symposium. From the previous studies and reports, we know that autistic adults are at elevated risk for depression, with reported lifetime rate estimates as high as 77%. Poor mental health likely impedes adults' functioning in different aspects of life and contribute to suboptimal long-term outcomes. Despite the need for effective mental health services, data on depression treatment for adults with autism are still lacking, with rather inconsistent findings of treatment effectiveness across different trials. Given the dire consequences of insufficiently treated depression, such as high rates of suicidality and psychiatric hospitalization, we need to understand the mechanism of mental health problems in the context of life of adults on the autism spectrum and identify treatment targets to support adults to realize their full potentials. Currently, we are limited by the little information that is available regarding how autistic adults who are experiencing depressive symptoms are being served in the community and how their life experiences might be associated with depression. So given our collective interest in understanding the effects of services and life circumstances on depression in adults on the autism spectrum, we as a group launched an online survey study with the motivation to collect the needed data to inform our understandings of the current depression services landscape and possible mechanisms between life circumstances and mental health. While there are concerns around sampling biases and potential overestimate of psychiatric problems of clinical referred sample, we target adults living in the community directly to survey a broad range of autistic adults regardless of their current depressive symptoms. In order to obtain a relatively large adult sample from the community, we took advantage of the Spark Research Match registry hosted by the Simons Foundation to recruit independent adults who are 18 to 35 years old. Given our online survey design and the collection of self-report measures, we recruited only adults who can consent for themselves and provide self-report. We chose to focus on young adult age range because the previous studies have shown that young adults are extremely vulnerable to mental health challenges and may also face additional barriers to services as they transition out of the school system and into adulthood. Moreover, we chose to only recruit adults who receive a diagnosis of autism from a professional before the age of 18 to control for some heterogeneity across the autism spectrum, as studies have shown that adults who receive their autism diagnosis later in adulthood and those who self-identify as autistic present different profiles and may differ in important ways in mental health and life aspects that requires more careful examinations in future studies. We also require that participants to have completed background history questionnaire so we can obtain demographic characteristics directly without asking again. Thanks to the support in participant incentives from the FA Fund, we were able to offer a $25 e-gift card to individuals who completed the survey. With a recruitment goal of 300, we were able to meet the goal in a week and close our survey down. We have 322 participants consented and 315 completed the full survey. So a brief overview of the sample characteristics. In our sample, we have a pretty balanced sex ratio, and we also see 2/3 of the individuals who are currently single, and then about 2/3 who have received educational levels beyond high school. And we can see also that about half of the sample have paid employment at the time of survey. Given our primary focus of the project is on depression in autistic adults, we collected two widely used self-report measures of depressive symptoms. One is Back Depression Inventory, BDI. BDI includes 21 groups of statements assessing depressed mood over the past 2 weeks. Each statement were assigned a score of 0 to 3, and a total score of 20 or above were considered to be in the moderate or above range of depressive symptoms. The other measure we collected was Depression Anxiety Stress Scale, DAS. DAS measures not only depression, but also anxiety and stress, with 14 items for each subscale. And a score of 14 and above on the DAS depression subscale presents moderate levels of depressive symptoms or higher. We included both measures to increase the sensitivity to capture adults with clinically elevated depressive symptoms. So there are 3 presentations in the current symposium, and all 3 present analysis and findings using the data from the current sample of autistic adults recruited from the SPARK Research Registry. And under the larger theme of depression, depression services, and life circumstances, I will start off by sharing our findings related to how depressed adults on the autism spectrum are being served in the community in the first presentation. And then the second presentation will focus on the analysis led by Dr. Ryan Adams at the Cincinnati Children's, where we examine the relationships between the amount and the perception of time spent in social activities and depressive symptoms and loneliness in this adult sample. Ms. Linnea Lampinen, who is the clinical research coordinator at our lab at UCSF, will be delivering the presentation. Mrs. Florencia Pezzimenti and Dr. Julie Taylor will be leading the third presentation, focusing on the experiences of job termination and examining its correlates of demographic and mental health variables in adults. And then Dr. Katherine Gotham at Rowan University is our discussant for today's symposium, and she will summarize the findings across the 3 studies and discuss potential implications for research and practice. Lastly, we will have 10 minutes to open up for questions at the end. Now I will start the first presentation on depression, depression service use, and barriers. As mentioned before, information specifically focused on depression services for autistic adults is limited. The few studies reported on mental health services in general have found that autistic adults report high unmet mental health needs, with 35 to 50% of adults sharing unmet needs for mental or behavioral health services. Moreover, service accesses likely differ for different groups of individuals, resulting in service disparities, especially those with low socioeconomic status or education levels and racial ethnic minority groups possibly experience more difficulties and challenges. Previous studies have also identified a number of service barriers for individuals on the autism spectrum and their families. Some frequently identified barriers include financial burdens, insurance issues, and limited access to trained professionals. In a recent qualitative study from UK, autistic adults shared that professionals have limited knowledge of mental health problems in ASD. However, specific barriers related to depression services have not yet been carefully examined. With relatively little known about the landscape of depression diagnosis and treatment services in the community, especially around who is depressed and what services they are getting, we set out to answer the following research questions. First, how likely are autistic adults who experience elevated levels of depressive symptoms to receive depression diagnosis? Who are more likely to be diagnosed? Second, how likely are they to receive needed treatments for depression? And what kind of treatment are they getting? And who are more likely to be treated? Lastly, are there any barriers to accessing needs services for depression? If so, what are they? To focus on autistic adults who experience elevated levels of depressive symptoms, we considered participants whose scores exceeded the cutoff of a moderate level of depression on either the BDI or the DAS depression subscale to be currently depressed. I should also mention that the elevated scores on these instruments do not equate a clinical diagnosis of depression, but scores above cutoffs on one or both measures do indicate a high likelihood that an individual could meet criteria for clinical diagnosis of depression and that individuals are experiencing depressive symptoms that might need clinical attention. Therefore, in the current analysis, 147 of the current sample who scored above the elevated levels of depressive symptoms are considered as a clinical analytical sample for the current study. To gather information on service status, we asked participants to respond whether they have ever received a depression diagnosis. If so, when they received the diagnosis, who was a professional gave the diagnosis? And how old were they? If they were never diagnosed with depression, we asked if they have ever felt they were depressed, and if any professionals had asked them about their depressive symptoms. And we then asked all participants to respond whether they have ever received treatment for depression, either currently or previously, and or both. And they are asked to report the different types of treatments. To understand better who are getting diagnosed and treated, we also included demographic correlates. The stable demographic information of sex and race ethnicity were considered for logistic models of ever receiving diagnosis or previous receiving depression treatment. While for the current depression treatment model, we also included variables of current life circumstances of employment status and education levels, in addition to the sex and race ethnicity variables, given that these more transient levels of current life circumstances are more relevant for current services only. So for the depression diagnosis, in the current sample, over 80% of currently depressed adults had received a professional diagnosis of depression, and the average age of diagnosis is about 15 years old, and most of them had received diagnosis from psychiatrists or psychologists. And among the 25 currently depressed adults who do not have received the diagnosis, the majority of them reported that they had felt they might be depressed in the past. And 2/3 of them have been asked by a professional about their depressive symptoms. The logistic regression with the depression diagnosis as a dependent variable show that even though females and males are equally likely to report elevated depressive symptoms, females are more likely than males to have received a formal depression diagnosis, with an adjusted odds ratio to be 3.44. And also in our study sample, we did not find significant differences across the racial groups. This is partially due to our sample being majority white. And this leaves us with insufficient power to detect any meaningful differences if there is any. As for depression treatment receipt, we found that over 80% of currently depressed adults had received some depression treatment either currently or previously, with about 60 of them are currently in treatment for depression. Logistic regression results show that adults who have received depression diagnosis are more likely to get treatment both currently and previously. And those who have education levels above high school degree are more likely to be in current treatment for depression. And when it comes to depression treatment types, medication is the most frequently received depression treatment, with about 90% of adults with depression diagnosis had received medication, as we can see on the bar chart. And about 2/3 of those who had depression diagnosis also reported receiving individual therapy. And together, 1/5 of them have received both medication and individual therapy. And we can see also on the bar chart that those with depression diagnosis are far more likely than those without diagnosis to receive either medication or individual therapy. This is consistent with our logistic regression results. And when we investigate the depression service barriers, 60 adults out of the 147 currently depressed adults reported having experienced barriers to access depression-related services. And out of the 60, 54 of them provided open text responses. And these open text responses were qualitatively coded for themes of the most co-occurring mentioned service barriers. And as shown in the table, the top 3 mentioned service barriers were financial and insurance issues, accessibility of care, or accessibility of a good fit of care. And the third one is professionals' lack of understanding. And to understand better what each of these barriers mean for different respondents, we have included quotes from specific participants. So here's one about financial and insurance issues. This participant wrote, "I originally had a therapist, but since I'm now unemployed, I could not afford to continue therapy long term. Especially with my insurance doubling this year, I cannot afford to receive help anymore. I just take my antidepressants and struggle through it, since I cannot get access to any other helpful sources." And related to the second most mentioned accessibility of care barrier, this participant wrote, "The lack of providers in my area who were willing to treat me and had the time to treat me is a major barrier, because there are so many people who need services." And then related to professionals' lack of understanding, this participant wrote, "Most therapy is geared towards neuronormative people, and therapists struggle to understand that I'm autistic and what being autistic means." So to sum up our findings from this current presentation, consistent with previously reported data, we found that about half of the sample reported elevated levels of depressive symptoms as measured by the 2 depressive symptom measures. And two-thirds out of the full sample of 315 adults had received the previous depression diagnosis. We also found that most of the currently depressed adults were diagnosed previously. However, there are still 17% of them that need to be recognized and served, especially given that they had previously raised concerns about their mood. Clinicians should pay extra attention to these individuals to provide symptom monitoring and support over time. We saw a similar trend with that in the general population, that females are at higher rate to receive depression diagnosis. Moreover, these sex differences in diagnosis of depression is observed in the absence of any differences in the rate of elevated depressive symptoms reported. This suggests that possible sex biases in clinical screening and diagnosing depression exist. And more studies are needed to examine this mechanism, and more information is needed to facilitate the clinical identification of depression in autistic adults regardless of their sex. Moreover, we found that being diagnosed with depression and higher education levels are associated with higher probability of receiving depression treatments. The fact that diagnosis serve as a gateway to treatment, this highlights the importance of identifying individuals who are depressed, since the unidentified individuals are unlikely to be treated. Meanwhile, policy changes and advocacy is also needed to help improve access to insurance-covered mental health care, especially for those with lower educational levels and fewer resources.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linnea Lampinen, and today I'm going to be talking to you about social activities, loneliness, and depressive symptoms in young adults on the autism spectrum. Individuals on the autism spectrum have difficulties across different social experiences. Multiple studies have found that both the amount and the quality of social experiences are problematic in autistic adults. And that's across different social contexts, so with family, with friends, and with other peer groups as well. In addition, individuals on the autism spectrum have high rates of depression, as Zheng talked about in her presentation. While the relationship between the amount of time spent in social activities and depressive symptoms have been well documented in typically developing individuals, this relationship is not as well understood in individuals with ASD. This is particularly concerning given the problems we know that autistic adults have, both in respect to social activities and depression. Previous studies that have looked at this relationship in individuals on the autism spectrum have focused on the quantity of social activities, but have largely ignored how individuals feel about that amount of time. Theories that have been developed on the effects of social experiences on depression in typically developing populations focus on this idea of individuals not having their social needs met. So for instance, Baumeister and Leary say that when intimacy needs aren't met, people become lonely, and that loneliness is linked to depression. These theories suggest that how one feels about the amount of time spent in social activities might be as important, if not more important, than the actual amount of time they spend. This idea might be particularly important for individuals on the autism spectrum, given the heterogeneity in terms of both social motivation and social skills. In other words, some individuals might be more or less motivated and have greater or lesser skills in certain activities, and in turn, they might desire differing amounts of time spent in those activities. For this study, we aim to examine how the amount of time spent in social activities and feelings about the amount of time spent, as well as the interaction between these two, are related to depression. We also wanted to do a validity test of this relationship by testing the indirect effect of loneliness. And this was mainly to make sure that if we do find a relationship between social activities and depression, that this relationship is really due to individuals not getting their social needs met, rather than another variable like general activity level. To do this, we collected several different measures. First, for depression, we collected the BDI-2 and the DOS. And for this study, we combined these two measures to increase the reliability of our depression measure. We did this by transforming the BDI and the DOS depression scale scores into z-scores and then averaging the two z-scores. All of our findings remain the same, whether we used either of the individual depression measures or our combined depression measure. For loneliness, we collected the Loneliness in Context questionnaire for adults by Asher and Weeks. Asher has a commonly used loneliness measure for adolescents, and this Loneliness in Context questionnaire just examines loneliness in adults in specific contexts. So for example, participants are asked to rate feelings of loneliness in contexts like bedtime or when they're in their home, etc. And for each of these contexts, participants rate this on a scale from 1 if they never feel lonely in that context, to 5 if they always feel lonely in that context. And finally, for social activities, we collected a revised version of the Social Interests and Habits questionnaire by Gotham et al. And this revised version of this questionnaire asks about several different types of social activities, including time with friends, time with family, talking and texting with friends, and going to social events, among other things. For each activity, participants rated two different measures. First was the amount of time spent on that activity, and second was their feelings about the amount of time spent. And I'll go over both of those right now. As I mentioned, participants rated the amount of time they spent in each social activity. And to create a total score for this variable, we summed these ratings across all 7 social activities. And this total score for amount of time varied from 0 if they never spent any time in any of the social activities to 42 if they did all 7 social activities every single day. Second, participants rated their feelings about the amount of time spent in each social activity. So they were asked, was the amount of time spent about right, too little, or too much? And for this analysis, we focused on the about right and too little responses, since there were so few people reporting that they spent too much time in these activities. To create a total score for this variable, we took the total number of too little ratings across all of the activities, and this rating varied from 0 if they had no too little ratings reported across any of the 7 activities, to 7 if they felt like they were spending too little time in all 7 of the activities. To test the research aims that I mentioned before, we used one moderated mediation model, and I'm going to go over that model right now. So this figure shows the moderated mediation model that we found using Hayes process macro for SPSS. And this figure is a lot to take in, but the important point to get from it is that this negative 0.06 index of moderated mediation indicates that the overall moderated mediation effect was significant, given that the 95% confidence interval did not cross 1. So what that means is that the indirect pathways between time spent in social activities and depressive symptoms are different depending on how individuals felt about the amount of time spent. So if they reported low levels of feeling like they were spending too little time versus reporting high levels of feeling like they were spending too little time. And I'm going to explain each of these issues separately in the next couple slides. So first, I'll go over the interaction between the amount of time spent in social activities and feelings about the amount of time spent. And then I'll go over the indirect effect of loneliness on this relationship. As I mentioned, we did find an interaction between the amount of time spent in social activities and feelings about the amount of time spent on depressive symptoms. This interaction was such that those who were at the mean, which was around 3 too little ratings across all of the activities, or those who were 1 standard deviation above the mean, which was between 4 to 5 too little ratings across all of the activities. For those individuals, the amount of time spent in social activities was associated with depressive symptoms. And that's the top 2 lines in this graph here. But for those who were 1 standard deviation below the mean, which was around 0 to 1 too little ratings across all of the activities, for those individuals, amount of time spent in social activities was not associated with depressive symptoms. And that's the bottom line in this graph. So basically, for people who believe that they aren't spending enough time in these social activities, the amount of time they spend actually is associated with depressive symptoms. But for people who think the amount of time they're spending in these social activities is about right for them, then the amount of time they spend actually isn't associated with depressive symptoms. Second, as I mentioned, we found a significant indirect effect of loneliness on the moderated effect between amount of time spent in social activities and depressive symptoms. So the moderated effect that I just showed you in the previous slide is being mediated by loneliness. Those who had high and medium levels of feeling like they weren't spending enough time in social activities are feeling lonely, and that loneliness is linked to depression. And just as a note, we're not talking about methodological mediation here. So we're just doing a validity check to test for the indirect effect of loneliness. This finding suggests that the relationship between social activities and depressive symptoms can be understood as individuals not getting their social needs met, as indicated by their feelings of loneliness. This is consistent with the previous theories that I covered, which suggest that rather than just quantity of social activities being important for depressive symptoms, the specific needs and feelings of the individual matter as well. In conclusion, perception about time spent in social activities is critical to consider when thinking about feelings of loneliness and the effect of social activities on depressive symptoms in adults on the autism spectrum. Many of our interventions are designed to increase the amount of social experiences in autistic adults. While quantity of social experiences might be important for some, it shouldn't be the only thing we consider when designing interventions. Future interventions might want to focus less on quantity and take more consideration of individuals' needs and preferences. And specifically, we might want to incorporate individuals' perceptions of their social activities into our clinical work and research. There are several limitations of the study. So first, we don't have a non-ASD comparison group. And this idea that perception and feelings about social activities matters for depressive symptoms might be important in other groups as well, but we weren't able to study that in this study. Second, as always, findings are specific to the sample and they might not be representative of the larger population of individuals on the autism spectrum. And finally, we can't determine direction of effects from this study. Other studies have found bidirectionality in the relationship between social activities and depressive symptoms, but we weren't able to study that here. And with that, I'm going to thank you all for having me here, and I'm going to give it off to our next presenter. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Florencia Pezzimenti, and I'm going to be talking about job terminations and its correlates among adults on the autism spectrum. So just to get started, I'm going to give some background as to why we are looking at this relationship. We know that the rate of unemployment and job loss is much higher for autistic adults than for neurotypical peers, and also when compared with other disability groups or other individuals with a disability. We also know that autistic adults who are employed often experience challenges and social difficulties on the job. Those can lead to termination or at least prematurely dismissal. Being fired from a job in particular happens often to autistic adults, and there is some anecdotal evidence of this group reporting feelings of depression, isolation, low self-esteem, and low self-worth right after that happens to them. In addition, there are some socio-demographic and mental health variables that have been shown to be important for individuals' job stability in the general population. And in those studies looking at general population, they found that involuntarily job loss is more likely for men than women, is associated with declines in both mental and physical health. It usually increases depressive symptoms, and it also leads to feelings of loneliness and social isolation, especially for males. So those demographics and mental health correlates that we know exist in the general population and that are related to involuntarily losing a job have not been explored in the autism population. We do know that continuous terminations and vocational failures have a negative effect on one person's finance, independence, quality of life, and mental health. We also know that frequently being fired may lead to permanent unemployment and increased reliance on government assistance, which is something that we all should strive to avoid. So because people with autism struggle in the workplace and sometimes find it hard to keep a job, it's particularly important to understand their experiences around being fired, as well as the potential factors that may be associated with getting fired. For this study, we had two main research aims. First, we wanted to examine the demographic and mental health correlates of being fired in a sample of 315 adults with autism who lived in the United States and were ages 18 to 35. And second, our second aim was to explore the subjective experience of being fired using a qualitative data analysis of self-reported reasons for involuntary job loss. So as mentioned in the previous presentations, we used self-report survey data that participants completed an online survey. We collected demographic variables such as age, sex, highest level of education received, employment and school status, and whether participants were receiving government benefits. We also asked about job termination history by asking all participants in the sample, have you ever been fired by an employer, with a yes/no response option. And then in addition, those who answered yes were asked the reason for being fired in an open-ended response that was later coded for our qualitative analysis. Last, we measured depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness, looking at the total scores for the Beck Depression Inventory, second edition, the DAS, anxiety and stress subscales, and also the loneliness in context questionnaire. So from 315 participants, 93 reported that they were fired by an employer. This is really high. And this is a highly educated sample of adults that we had. All of them had to be able to self-report in an online survey. And in that sample, 1 in 3 had been terminated from a job at least once. So 30% of the sample reported experiencing an involuntary job loss. To contextualize the results, when we look at group differences across depression, anxiety, and stress, more than half of the fired group received a clinical score of moderate or higher, which is significantly higher than the group that was never fired. And this is in all depression, anxiety, and stress measures. Then when we wanted to look into this further and see if there were any individual characteristics or demographic factors that predicted being fired, we used a logistic regression analysis and control for sex, age, whether or not someone was in school, whether the person had a bachelor's degree or higher education than that, and whether the person was receiving any government benefits. And when looking at this, we found that the only independent variable that shows a positive significant relationship with being fired is age. This is expected as the one, the older one gets, the more you've been around, and the chances of experiencing being fired increase significantly. But age was the only significant predictor of being fired. And this was surprising because we were expecting to see education as having a bachelor or higher as a potential predictive factor, but we didn't see that. So as you can see, this table has 4 logistic regression models depicting the relationship between having ever been fired and mental health variables. The reason why we separated these models is because we wanted to individually explore each of the mental health variables. Because they are highly correlated, we wanted to have separate models for each one of them. So when holding constant all of the demographic factors that I described, we see that a higher depression score in model 1, a higher anxiety score in model 2, a higher stress score in model 3, and a higher loneliness score in model 4 significantly increase the chances of being fired. Then for our second date, we wanted to see the subjective reasons for being fired, and participants were asked why or what was the reason for being fired, and we coded the responses in 13 different categories. The most reported reasons were work performance, like being too slow, not fast enough. Also, social difficulties was mentioned 15% of the time. Attendance was the third most mentioned reason, and mental health issues was the fourth most repeated reason for being fired. Last, we wanted to also understand if those responses that people were giving were internal reasons, something that they could control or something that was inherent to them. For example, attendance, mental health issues, lack of social skills, insubordination. If they were given external reasons like discrimination, lack of support, unhelpful team members, or really a mixture of both. And in the screen, I'm showing some of the examples that participants gave for internal, external, or reasons that were coded in both internal and external. But almost half of the participants, 42% of them, gave internal reasons for being fired. And this is interesting as it may suggest some insight and taking ownership of specific actions that explain why they were terminated. Alternatively, it could also be that individuals in this group are taking the blame for what happened to them. And this may be true, especially for people who have pre-existing depressive symptoms. We cannot explain a lot with what we have, but this is something that we thought was really interesting to look at. In conclusion, we know that adults with autism with higher mental health symptoms have higher risk of experiencing an involuntary job loss at some point in their lives. And we don't know the direction of this relationship, whether those who have higher depression, anxiety, and stress symptoms are more likely to experience a termination, or if being fired from a job gets people into a downward spiral that worsens mental health in this population. Longitudinal studies could better explain that relationship. Also, we know that having higher education, like a bachelor's degree or higher, does not seem to be a protective factor against losing a job by being fired, at least in our sample. And this was surprising, as we expected to see that this was a protective factor, but future longitudinal studies may be better equipped to answer that or to look more into that. And last, at least looking at the qualitative data, half of the individuals who experienced being fired identified internal reasons as the main cause of this happening to them. Maybe understanding how insight is playing into external versus internal reasons may be important for future research that aims to parse out if the reasons perceived are related to taking responsibility, taking the blame, and how this relates to mental health. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.
Hi, my name is Kate Gotham. I just wanted to start by saying what an honor it is to serve as a discussant for this symposium, primarily for two reasons. The first reason has to do with its co-chair, Summer Bishop. So my own research program focuses on studying how and why autistic people become depressed so that we can develop better treatments that address those pathways in particular. And I often start talks with the anecdote that as a graduate student, I co-led a social group for autistic adults. And I became interested in depression when we noticed several adults going in and out of depressive episodes over the many years the group was together. What I don't often say is that Summer Bishop was the founder of that social group. And when I was considering what to propose as a third dissertation paper, I had dismissed the idea of studying depression and autism because I am risk averse. And I thought I will never get research funding if I focus on a narrow slice of co-occurring psychopathology. And then I remember vividly sitting in Red Hawk in Ann Arbor, Michigan, across from Summer Bishop, talking about my dissertation. And she said, you know, someone needs to look at depression in this population. This is a big problem. And so, of course, I took Summer's word for it. And as usual, she was right. So it's particularly meaningful for me to be here more than a decade later as a discussant talking about depression and autism, excuse me, on a symposium about depression and autism chaired by Summer. So I owe her so much, like many of us do in this field. Oh, there she is. The second reason it's an honor to be here is because I also start my talks with a slide similar to this one about how there are several candidates as contributors to depression and autism. And I usually say, if I'm honest, I think changing the social environmental context will get us the most bang for the buck. But then I go on to talk about how my lab mostly focuses on the psychological and a bit on the bio domain. So this is a symposium that's focusing on probably the greater issue on what's going on for adults with autism in terms of ascertainment and access to mental health services, social opportunities, and employment. And these are exactly those kind of aspects of the social context that are particularly likely to influence depressed mood within autistic individuals. So as a discussant, I just want to quickly touch on each talk briefly, and then I have one slide as an overall summary. So starting with Zheng and Bishop, unfortunately, it's not much of a surprise that about half of this large adult, the SPARC sample, reported being currently depressed. It was somewhat encouraging, however, that a vast majority of those in the currently depressed group had a professional depression diagnosis, about 90% of women and about 75% of depressed men. And so the authors discuss possible sex biases in screening and diagnosing depression in males, as well as the need for autism-specific instruments. So there's some movement on the instrumentation front. My lab is working on one right now, and there's an about to be published instrument from Sarah Cassidy and Jackie Rogers' group as well. One of the things I was wondering was all participants in this current SPARC sample had autism diagnoses prior to age 18. But in line with earlier work from Sarah Cassidy and Simon Baron-Cohen's lab, there have been suggestions that later age of initial autism diagnosis may be associated with greater rates of depression and suicidality. And it would be interesting to see if you see the same phenomenon even within this childhood diagnosed sample. So because autism itself may be harder to notice or diagnose in girls, that might either contribute to the development of depression in the first place, possibly, so not having the self-understanding or resources that may come with an autism diagnosis, or perhaps later autism diagnosis contributes to greater depression ascertainment because a family is interacting with more healthcare professionals while looking for answers. So also from Zheng and Bishop, we see that a higher percentage than I would have guessed receive individual behavioral therapy, yet still probably far fewer than need it. But again, these 122 participants, I believe, include only those scoring in the moderate range on self-report inventories of depressive symptoms. So on the BDI, that's people who score 6 or more points higher than the initial cutoff for clinical concern in the general population. And we know it's harder to tell who's really depressed or at risk of depression among autistic participants in these mild and sub-threshold ranges, but that would likely significantly add to the number here who are underserved. And the last thing I wanted to note is that accessibility of good fit in mental health care or an understanding professional is right up there in participants' reported barriers to services. So in line with Brenna Maddox's 2020 paper in autism, we see that autistic adults often don't get entry to community healthcare options, in part because providers feel that they don't have the training or expertise necessary to work with someone with autism. And there might be relatively easy things to do to change these perceptions or disseminate training around these gaps. So moving to the Lampinen and Adams presentation, they have this lovely graph emphasizing that depressive symptoms did not appear to be associated with more or less time spent in social opportunities for those people who didn't see themselves as not having enough social engagement. So increasing social opportunities is not a one-size-fits-all panacea. In fact, it may not even be indicated as a way to improve mental health in those who can say, I don't need that or particularly want it. We found something similar in a recent study out of our lab, that for adults who reported having more capability to experience social pleasure, there was a much stronger association between autism symptoms and loneliness. And then in turn, loneliness was our strongest statistical predictor of depression. And we're currently trying to follow up on this longitudinally in college students to see if unfulfilled social motivation precedes an increase in depressive symptoms, or if it's more likely to be the opposite in the classic sense of depression causing social withdrawal. But as a take-home point, I think we're seeing more and more evidence for an individual differences approach when looking at outcomes associated with social opportunity and social satisfaction. And I think that's really in line with that precision medicine movement, which is so important. And finally, from Pezzimenti and Taylor, we again hit against these bidirectional effects. Which comes first, the mental health problems or the job loss event? And I thought this was such a creative way to press at this in terms of coding internal versus external attributions for being fired. Approximately 57%, sorry, this blue and green put together, 57% of participants who had lost a job identified at least partially a partial reason that directly reflected their own performance or personality. And as the authors suggested, that could be because if you're already depressed, you're more likely to make these internal attributions. But as we scan down these examples, it sounds like there's not only depressive cognitive distortions here, but we can really imagine how some of these play out in workplaces. And then adding to that, even some of these external reasons identified hit on participants' sense of acceptance or lack thereof, which also likely has a more personal impact than, say, losing your job to nepotism. So job loss affects and is affected by the mental health of the worker. And as the authors pointed out, it's not just a single insult, but it rather has that cascading effect in which risk factors for depression accumulate, including one's sense of self-worth and place in society, and also these practical stressors like financial insecurity. So to put all these things together, again, the social context of being an autistic adult in the current world is no doubt inherently wrapped up with the mental health of the autistic community. Here were some of my specific takeaways from these presentations. We've got to be better at picking up depression in milder cases before it becomes moderate depression. We have to be on the lookout for sex and gender biases and ascertainment. Try to make treatment more accessible, particularly on the financial level, and community provider fit and comfort level. We need to keep individual variability at the front of our mind for all of these biopsychosocial risk factors and evaluations of outcome. And again, work toward that precision matching of treatments that are wanted and needed versus universally applied. And finally, we need to bolster workplace supports for autistic employees for many different reasons, but and also think about that psychological impact of losing a job or even struggling at one's job, and what kind of supports can make meaning of that and are needed there. So, and finally, to look at the intersectionality across these risk factors. So I think I'm at the end of the time. I thank the presenters for these important takeaways, and I urge us as a community to continue to work towards supporting mental health in this community. Thank you.